During the grand presentation of the maidens, a stuffy, silent affair in the capital, Darius is pacing, looking terrifying, inspecting the women like prized horses. Winnie, utterly fed up with the archaic pageantry, accidentally speaks her internal monologue out loud in the dead silent hall. Why must the alpha always claim the mate? The king stops dead. He approaches her, looming and terrifying. The court holds its breath, expecting her banishment. Instead, Darius, who is desperate for a mate who isn't a political sycophant, has a terrifying reaction. He offers her his neck right then and there. Very well. Claim me. Welcome back to Tiana's Collections. We are bringing you another fully immersive, swoon-worthy shifter romance audiobook. Expect dangerous royals, unexpected mates, and plot twists you won't see coming. Make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Now, let's step into the world of today's story. Chapter 1. The grand hall of the capital was so quiet I could hear the silk skirts of 300 unmarried noblewomen slowly suffocating them to death. Or perhaps that was just me. My corset was laced tight enough to permanently rearrange my ribs, and my bad leg, the left one, crushed by an overly enthusiastic pony when I was 10, was beginning to throb with a vicious, rhythmic ache. We were arranged in agonizingly perfect rows for the presentation of the maidens, a medieval meat market masquerading as high society tradition. At the front of the room paced King Darius. He was a hulking, terrifying monument to biological supremacy. Broad-shouldered, impossibly tall, and wrapped in stiff, gold-threaded velvet that looked like it weighed more than I did. His scent, cedar, and something sharp, like an impending thunderstorm, rolled over the assembly in heavy, oppressive waves. He was inspecting us, literally sniffing the air as he walked down the line of trembling aristocrats, looking less like a man searching for a bride and more like a very stressed bureaucrat auditing a tax ledger. Don't look at him, Winnie, I told myself. Just blend into the wallpaper, let him pick your insufferably perfect sister, and let's all go home. But my leg had other plans. A vicious cramp seized my calf. I tried to shift my weight subtly, but the polished marble floor was essentially ice. My stiff leather boot slipped. I lurched forward, breaking the perfect geometric line of maidens. My elbow aggressively clipped a duke's daughter, sending her feathered fan flying into the face of a terrifyingly severe duchess. The king stopped dead. 300 heads snapped in my direction. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a physical vacuum. My filter, a flimsy mechanism on a good day, completely disintegrated under the sheer agony in my calf and the humiliating heat rushing to my cheeks. The absurdity of it all, the stiff collars, the absolute silence, this giant, terrifying man judging us by the biological output of our sweat glands, boiled over. Why must the alpha always claim the mate? The words echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I slapped both hands over my mouth, but it was far too late. The blasphemy was out there, hovering in the air like a foul odor. The duke's daughter next to me actually whimpered. King Darius turned slowly. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable marble, his dark eyes locking onto me with the intensity of a predator who had just spotted a particularly stupid, limping rabbit. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, predatory strides. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable roar, for the royal guards to drag me away, for a public shaming that would plunge my family into generations of rural poverty. Instead, the heavy metallic clank of armor hitting marble echoed through the hall. I opened one eye. The king of the realm, the most feared man in a century, was on his knees, right in front of me. The top of his dark, immaculately styled head was exactly level with my corset strings. He tilted his chin up, exposing the thick, tanned column of his throat. A highly illegal, scandalous offering of absolute submission. Very well, Darius said. His voice was a rich, dark rumble that vibrated straight through the floorboards and up into my aching leg. Claim me. The entire court gasped in unison. A woman somewhere in the back row actually started hyperventilating. My brain flatlined. The terrifying king was kneeling, offering his throat to me, the clumsy, limping daughter of a minor rural lord. the sheer, overwhelming scent of him. Up close, it was dizzying, completely short-circuiting my biological instincts. I stammered, staring at his exposed jugular. The power imbalance shifted so violently I felt completely seasick. I think I left the oven on. Before the king could formulate a response to that absolute nonsense, the room tilted violently to the left and I fainted dead away onto the polished marble floor. Chapter 2. The first thing my brain registered when consciousness finally decided to return was the smell of aged parchment, beeswax, and an overwhelming, distinctly masculine scent of cedar wood. The second thing I registered was that I was no longer wearing my agonizingly tight boots. I cracked one eye open. I was lying flat on my back upon a tufted Chesterfield sofa that probably cost more than my family's entire estate. The heavy oak paneling of the room indicated I was somewhere deep within the king's private chambers. An oven! A deep, thoroughly unimpressed voice rumbled from across the room. You claimed in front of the entire royal council that you needed to check an oven. I bolted upright, immediately regretting it as the room spun in a lazy circle. King Darius sat behind a massive mahogany desk, still clad in his rigid, gold-threaded armor. He was holding a very delicate feathered quill that looked absurdly small in his massive, battle-hardened hand. In my defense, Your Majesty, I rasped, rubbing my temples. I panicked. My flight or fight response is severely skewed toward culinary excuses. Darius set the quill down with a sharp clack. He did not look angry, which was somehow far more terrifying. He looked entirely calculating. Do you know what the council had planned for me today, Winifred? A public execution? I offered weakly. Because if it's mine, I would prefer to keep my head. I have a very nice hat collection. A betrothal, he corrected, ignoring my rambling. He stood up, pacing the length of his study. His sheer physical size was staggering. The man didn't just walk. He occupied space like a slow-moving avalanche. They intend to force an arrangement with Lady Beatrice, a woman who, if I may be blunt, possesses the personality of a wet cobblestone and whose family is actively plotting to defund the eastern borders. She does drop her fan a lot, I muttered, recalling the incident right before I ruined my life. I needed a distraction, Darius continued, stopping to brace his heavy hands on the edge of the desk, leaning toward me. His dark eyes locked onto mine. And then, in the midst of absolute silence, you offered me the most spectacular, scandalous, delightfully disrespectful exit strategy in the history of the monarchy. I blinked. You aren't going to throw me in the dungeon? I am going to court you, he stated firmly. I choked on my own saliva, hacking violently into my elbow. You are going to what? It is a wager, Darius clarified, pulling a long scroll of parchment from his desk. A completely fabricated, highly structured arrangement. You will accompany me on the royal tour for 1 month. The council cannot legally force a marriage if I am actively pursuing a claimed mate. It buys me time to dismantle Beatrice's political backing. And what exactly do I get out of this? I demanded, finding my footing and standing up. My left leg throbbed, causing me to list slightly to the side, but I crossed my arms to project an air of authority I absolutely did not feel. Besides the sheer terror of being stared at by a man who looks like he eats raw meat for breakfast, the corner of the king's mouth twitched. It was an incredibly subtle movement, but it completely transformed his terrifying face into something devastatingly handsome. I will grant your family a permanent tax exemption and fund the repair of your rural roads. I stared at him. The roads in my village are mostly just enthusiastic mud puddles. Then they shall be paved with stone, he replied smoothly, if you agree to the terms. He handed me the parchment. I unrolled it, expecting sweeping declarations of royal duty. Instead, I found a painfully dry, heavily itemized list of behavioral protocols. Item 4. I read aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet study. Mandatory public longing stares. You want to schedule how we look at each other? Structure is the backbone of a successful deception, Winifred, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. I suggest 3 lingering stares per day. held for no less than 4 seconds. Absolutely not, I countered, tossing the parchment onto the desk. I have a terrible attention span. 2 stares and neither of us is allowed to look like we are actively trying to solve a math problem. Agreed. He nodded, dipping his quill to strike through the line. Item 7. Physical contact. We must appear completely overcome by primal magnetism. I am terrified of you, Your Majesty, I pointed out, leaning over the desk to point at the ink. If you try to act overcome, I will assume you are attacking me and I will bite you. A queen who bites, Darius mused, his voice dropping an octave, thick with a sudden, raspy amusement. The council would have apoplexy. Before I could form a witty retort to the sudden, intense heat radiating from his chest, heavy footsteps pounded in the corridor outside. Your Majesty! A muffled voice barked through the heavy oak. The High Council demands an audience. They claim this courtship is a farce. Darius's eyes widened. They are early. The brass doorknob began to turn. Look overcome, Darius hissed. How? I whisper yelled. He didn't answer. Instead, the terrifying, highly logical king of the realm lunged across his mahogany desk, grabbed me firmly by the waist and yanked. He completely misjudged his own shifter strength. I flew over the edge of the desk, scattering inkwells and parchment, and landed squarely straddling his lap just as the heavy doors slammed open. Chapter 3. The royal carriage was less a mode of transportation and more a claustrophobic, velvet-lined torture device. For the past 4 hours, we had been bouncing along the cobblestone roads leading out of the capital. The space between my knees and King Darius's boots was approximately 3 inches. Every time the carriage hit a rut, our knees brushed, sending a jolt of terrifying, static electricity straight up my spine. I was pressed flush against the window, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the furious monarch sitting opposite me. Darius was practically vibrating with rage. His jaw was locked so tightly, I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. His dark eyes were narrowed into a lethal glare, fixed on a spot just above my left shoulder. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and his chest expanded with a series of sharp, furious hitches. He looked like a wolf preparing to tear out someone's throat. I should never have agreed to this, I thought frantically, gripping the velvet armrest. The moment the council saw us tangled on his desk, he had to double down. Now he's trapped with me, and he clearly hates my entire existence. Your Majesty, I finally said, unable to endure the murderous silence any longer. If my presence in this carriage is so deeply offensive to you, you could have strapped me to the luggage cart. I assure you, I have an excellent center of gravity. Darius's head snapped toward me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, gleaming with unshed moisture. It is not your presence, Winifred, he gritted out, his voice a strangled rasp. Then why have you been glaring at me like I insulted your ancestors for the past 40 leagues? I demanded, crossing my arms defensively. I am not glaring, he wheezed, suddenly gripping the edge of his seat, his knuckles turning stark white. He squeezed his eyes shut, his massive shoulders trembling. I am trying, desperately, not to die. I blinked, dropping my defensive posture. Are you having a heart attack? Should I yell for the driver? Do shifter kings have heart attacks, or does your chest just naturally sound like a dying bellows? What? Darius gasped, pressing a heavy hand against his face. What in the name of the old gods? Are you wearing a dress? I said, looking down at my green silk skirts. It belongs to my sister. It's a bit snug in the ribcage, but... Not the garments, he interrupted, his voice dropping into a desperate, feral growl. The scent, the overwhelming, suffocating miasma clinging to your skin. I sniffed my own wrist. Oh, that's lavender. My sister soaked me in it before the ceremony. She says it attracts high-value mates. It's imported from the southern coast. Darius's eyes flew open. They were streaming with tears. The terrifying, stoic Alpha King looked utterly defeated. I am violently allergic to lavender, The sheer absurdity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. "You're allergic? To flowers?" "To that specific weed, yes," he snapped, leaning back and covering his nose with a silk handkerchief he produced from his jacket. "It burns my sinuses like hot iron. I have been suppressing a bodily reflex for 4 hours to maintain the dignity of the crown." "You didn't want to sneeze in front of me?" I asked, a bubble of hysterical laughter rising in my throat. "A king does not sneeze," he bellowed, thoroughly outraged. "It is undignified. It shows weakness." "It shows you have nasal cavities," I shot back, leaning forward, completely forgetting my fear of him. "Darius, for the love of the gods, just let it out before your head actually explodes. I am perfectly—" he started, dropping the handkerchief. His breath hitched. Once. Twice. His terrifying, intimidating aura completely vanished, replaced by the sheer, unavoidable biology of a severe allergen. "Achoo!" The sneeze was of epic, world-shattering proportions. It was a booming, concussive blast that practically rattled the gilded windows of the carriage. Outside, the horses screamed in absolute terror. The carriage violently lurched to the right. The wheel hit a deep rut at the exact moment the driver pulled hard on the reins. Gravity ceased to exist. I flew off the velvet bench, completely airborne, a tangle of green silk and flailing limbs. I didn't hit the floor. I slammed directly into a wall of solid, furious muscle. Darius caught me midair. His massive arms banded around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest as the carriage tilted dangerously on 2 wheels before slamming back down onto the road with a bone-jarring crash. The carriage rolled to a halt. The dust settled outside the windows. Inside, there was absolute, ringing silence. I was sprawled completely across his lap. My face was buried in the crook of his neck. Underneath the scent of dust and my offensive lavender, the pure, unfiltered scent of his intense body heat slammed into my senses. Cedar, rain, and spice. My biology reacted violently, an ancient, instinctual click echoing in my blood. I slowly lifted my head. Darius was staring down at me, his chest heaving, his eyes entirely black as his pupils dilated to consume his irises. "Winifred," he whispered, the sound a ragged, completely unguarded confession. Before either of us could move, the carriage door was violently yanked open from the outside, revealing the deeply unimpressed, sneering face of our host for the evening. "Well," the Duke of Oakhaven drawled, looking down his long, aristocratic nose at the tangled pile of royalty and rural nobility inside the carriage. How delightfully robust. The Duke possessed the kind of face that suggested he had spent his entire life smelling something mildly rotten. He was flanked by 10 perfectly polished guards, all of whom were staring wide-eyed at their king, who was currently covered in lavender-scented, limping catastrophe. Darius's eyes snapped back to their normal dark brown. He gently but firmly shifted his grip on my waist, effortlessly lifting me off his lap and setting me onto the bench beside him. He smoothed the lapels of his velvet coat, completely ignoring the fact that his hair was now charmingly disheveled. "Duke Harrison," Darius greeted, his voice returning to that terrifying flat rumble. "Your roads are atrocious." "My deepest apologies, Your Majesty," the Duke simpered, though his eyes darted to me with undisguised malice. We did not expect the crown to travel with such enthusiastic baggage. 10 minutes later, we were forced into a formal garden stroll. The rain from the previous night had turned the Duke's sprawling, manicured estate into a damp, treacherous labyrinth. I was struggling. The cobblestone paths were slick with moss, and my bad leg was protesting every uneven step. I fell behind the king, trying to mask my limp by leaning heavily on my parasol, but I was failing miserably. The Duke dropped back to walk beside me, his hands clasped behind his back. "Such a pity," the Duke murmured, his voice low enough that Darius, walking 10 paces ahead, supposedly couldn't hear. "About the uneven gait. The king must be terribly charitable to entertain a wager with a woman of your physical standing." My stomach plummeted. The insult wasn't veiled. It was a direct strike at the one vulnerability I couldn't hide. "Charity is a virtue, Your Grace." I replied, forcing a tight, painfully bright smile. Though I suppose politeness is not. The Duke's eyes flashed. You won't last a week at court, little bird. The Alpha King requires perfection, not a broken toy. Hot tears of frustration pricked the corners of my eyes. I wanted to retreat. I wanted to turn around, march back to the dreadful carriage, and hide. I pivoted sharply to excuse myself, completely forgetting the slick moss beneath my boots. My bad legs simply gave out. I pitched forward with a gasp, my arms flailing for purchase. My hand caught the heavy velvet of a coat, not the Duke's, but Darius's, who had suddenly, impossibly stopped and turned right beside me. My momentum was too great. I collided heavily with his broad chest, knocking him off balance just as he stood on the sheer edge of the garden's massive, decorative koi pond. For a fraction of a second, the terrifying king of the realm looked incredibly surprised. Then, physics took over. With a spectacular, resounding splash, King Darius went over backward, plunging fully clothed into 3 feet of freezing, muddy pond water. A collective gasp echoed from the Duke's entourage. I stood on the path, horrifyingly dry, clutching the king's torn velvet button in my fist. Darius sat up in the pond. His immaculate hair was plastered to his forehead. Lily pads clung to his broad shoulders. A single, very confused orange fish flopped against his thigh. "Your Majesty!" the Duke shrieked, rushing forward in absolute horror. "Guards! Fetch towels! Seize the girl!" Darius held up a single, mud-soaked hand. The entire garden froze. He slowly rose to his feet, water cascading from his heavy boots. He looked like a swamp monster rising from the depths. He calmly wiped a smear of mud from his jaw, his dark eyes locking entirely on the trembling Duke. "You misunderstand, Harrison," Darius deadpanned, his voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. "She did not push me." The Duke blinked. "But, Your Majesty, we all saw—" "It is a primal display of vitality," Darius interrupted, his tone suggesting the Duke was incredibly stupid for not knowing this. "A traditional bonding ritual of the eastern provinces to connect with the earth before claiming a mate." I stared at him, my jaw practically unhinged. He was making it up. The rigid, terrifying king was standing in a pond, aggressively lying to protect my reputation. A ritual?" the Duke stammered, looking completely baffled. "Indeed," Darius said. The corner of his mouth twitched again, a dark, dangerous spark lighting up his eyes. "And a ritual is not complete unless both mates bask in the soil." Before my brain could process his words, Darius reached out his massive hands, gripped me firmly by the waist, and effortlessly yanked me right off the cobblestone path. I shrieked as I plummeted face first into the freezing mud. The mud was everywhere. It was in my ears, plastered against my teeth, and seeping into the impossible layers of my borrowed silk petticoats. I sat waist-deep in the Duke's prized koi pond, spitting out a mouthful of duckweed, entirely convinced my life was over. But when I wiped the sludge from my eyes, King Darius was not furious. He was staring down at me with an expression of intense, terrifying satisfaction, as if pulling a woman into a freezing bog was the most logical action he had taken all week. "Now," Darius rumbled, his voice thick with gravel as he stood up in the water, "we are appropriately bonded to the earth." 2 hours later, after an army of horrified servants had scrubbed us raw and shoehorned me into a dry, severely uncomfortable velvet gown, Darius cornered me in a dim corridor outside the Duke's dining hall. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, but Darius smelled only of expensive soap and coiled tension. "You cannot simply apologize every time someone insults your gate, Winifred," he lectured, leaning his massive frame against the stone wall. "The court is entirely composed of biological predators. If you act like prey, they will enthusiastically eat you." "I am prey," I pointed out, gesturing to my bad leg. "I have the structural integrity of a damp crouton." "You are my claimed mate," he corrected, his dark eyes flashing. "You need to project dominance. You need an alpha glare. Show me your teeth." I blinked. "You want me to bare my fangs in the middle of a hallway?" I want you to look threatening, he insisted, stepping closer. The sheer, overwhelming heat radiating from his chest made my pulse flutter wildly against my collarbone. Snarl at me? I took a deep breath, scrunched my nose, and curled my upper lip. Darius stared. He did not look intimidated. The terrifying king actually bit the inside of his cheek, his broad chest vibrating with a suppressed, silent laugh. What? I demanded, dropping the snarl. Was it too terrifying? Did I frighten the monarch? Winifred, he breathed, leaning down until his nose brushed my ear, sending a catastrophic shiver down my spine. You look like a squirrel fiercely defending a walnut. I am doing my best, I huffed, pushing at his solid chest. Before he could respond, a shrill voice echoed down the corridor. Lady Clarice, a local noblewoman with hair piled so high it defied gravity, glided toward us. She openly sneered at my boots. Your Majesty, Clarice purred, we are so charmed to host your little rural project, though it is a pity she lacks the physical grace required to stand beside a king. I braced myself. I expected Darius to roar, to flex his muscles and physically assert his dominance. Instead, Darius didn't even blink. He casually adjusted his cuffs, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm monotone. Tell me, Lady Clarice, does your family still rely on the crown's subsidy for your northern trade routes? Clarice paled. Yes, Your Majesty. Excellent. Darius deadpanned, turning to his hovering treasurer in the shadows. Audit her entire estate. Strip the subsidies. Immediately. Clarice gasped, clutching her pearls. I stood completely frozen as the king casually offered me his arm. I suddenly realized that holding the leash to a terrifyingly petty bureaucrat was far more exhilarating than any physical roar. It is a single cot, Darius said. He was staring at the tiny woven reed bed shoved into the corner of a dusty inn room. Lord Sterling, a notoriously smug rival from the capital who had intentionally booked out the entire inn to humiliate us, stood in the doorway looking violently pleased with himself. It is the last bed available, Your Majesty, Sterling simpered. Such tight quarters. I do hope the rural lady does not crowd your royal presence. It was the classic trap, the orchestrated forced proximity. Darius slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the smirking lord. I am the Alpha King, Darius rumbled, his voice so low it rattled the cheap window panes. I do not fold myself onto a peasant's cot for your amusement, Sterling, nor do I accept charity from a man whose biological scent resembles frightened cabbage. Sterling's smirk vanished. Winifred, Darius barked, grabbing my hand. We are leaving. Leaving? I sputtered as he dragged me down the wooden stairs and out into the freezing night air. Darius, it is sleeting outside. Where exactly are we going? He didn't answer. He marched us straight past the inn and violently shoved open the heavy wooden doors of the royal stables. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of sweet hay and massive horses. You cannot be serious, I whispered, staring at the hayloft. You are refusing a bed out of pure spite? I am an apex predator, Winifred, he declared, stripping off his heavy velvet coat to create a makeshift blanket. I will sleep in the hay before I let that simpering idiot think he cornered me. I burst out laughing. I couldn't stop. The absolute absurdity of the most powerful man in the kingdom stubbornly climbing a wooden ladder into a pile of dry grass was too much. Darius stopped halfway up, glaring down at me, but the corners of his mouth betrayed a sharp, genuine smile. Are you coming, or shall I leave you to the cabbage? He asked. The night was freezing, but the hay was surprisingly soft. I huddled under his velvet coat, shivering until Darius groaned, shifted closer, and aggressively pulled me flush against his back to share his intense, furnace-like body heat. It was a completely pragmatic, entirely non-romantic survival tactic. Until morning. I woke up to absolute darkness and a strange, heavy weight pressing me into the floorboards. I blinked, trying to orient myself. We were no longer lying flat. During the night, Darius's primal shifter instincts had apparently bypassed his logical brain entirely. He had systematically dragged every pile of hay, 3 horse blankets, and my discarded shawl into a massive circular barricade. He had built a literal nest, and I was trapped in the dead center of it. Darius was curled entirely around me, his massive arm caging my waist, his face buried deep in the crook of my neck. He was making a sound. It wasn't a snore. It was a deep, rhythmic, chest-vibrating purr. I held my breath, terrified to wake him. But as I shifted my bad leg, his eyes snapped open, pure, dilated black, and he dragged his nose aggressively along my jawline, utterly feral and deeply awake. The southern hot springs were famous for their healing minerals and blindingly thick fog. The air was heavy, practically dripping with condensation and the sharp scent of sulfur. I limped through the damp, marble-tiled corridors, desperately clutching my heavy wool robe. A servant had pointed me toward the women's pavilion, but the steam was so dense I could barely see my own boots. "Hello?" I called out softly, stepping through a gilded archway. The room was vast, dominated by a massive, circular pool of bubbling turquoise water. I squinted through the haze. There were no other women. In fact, there was no one at all, except for the colossal, entirely naked man rising from the center of the pool. My breath caught so sharply it burned my throat. It was Darius. His broad back was completely bare, slick with mineral water, highlighting a map of silver, jagged scars that proved the king did not win his throne merely by sitting at a desk. Water cascaded down his muscular shoulders, trailing lower and lower. "Turn around, Winnie," my brain screamed. "Walk away right now." But my biology utterly betrayed me. The concentrated scent of wet cedar and intense heat flooded my senses, locking my boots to the marble. He turned his head. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his eyes widening slightly as he spotted me through the steam. "Winifred," he rasped, his voice dropping an octave, echoing off the wet tiles. Pure, unadulterated panic struck. I spun on my good heel to flee, completely forgetting that wet marble was nature's deadliest trap. My bad leg gave out entirely. I didn't just fall. I launched myself backward, arms flailing wildly, my heavy wool robe tangling around my ankles as I plunged backward into the deep end of the boiling pool. The water swallowed me whole. Instantly, the heavy wool absorbed 100 pounds of water, dragging me straight toward the tiled bottom. I thrashed, kicking my legs, but the fabric was a literal anchor. I broke the surface, gasping for air. "Darius!" I choked out before slipping under again. Strong hands clamped around my waist. The terrifying heat of his bare skin burned straight through my soaked clothing as he violently yanked me upward, breaking the surface. I coughed aggressively, clinging to his broad, naked shoulders like a panicked barnacle. "Stop thrashing!" he commanded, his chest heaving against mine as he kept us afloat. "You are wearing a carpet." "It's a modesty robe," I wheezed, utterly mortified by the slick friction of his bare chest against me. He easily hoisted me up, setting my feet onto a submerged stone bench. The water lapped just beneath my collarbone, but I was plastered against him, every inch of my body intensely aware of his complete lack of clothing. "Your modesty nearly drowned you," he breathed, his eyes completely black as he stared down at my lips. His hands slowly slid from my waist to rest heavily on my hips. The tension in the water was thick, electric, and utterly undeniable. I opened my mouth to speak, to diffuse the terrifying intimacy. "Your Majesty," a muffled voice shouted from the corridor outside the archway. "We have a security breach. Someone has stolen your garments from the pavilion bank." Darius stiffened, looking toward the empty stone ledge where his clothes had been. We were trapped, alone in a pool, surrounded by guards, with absolutely nothing to wear. "Someone stole my trousers," Darius stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he stared at the empty stone bench. "This is an assassination attempt on my dignity," I wheezed, still treading water while clutching the heavy, suffocating mass of my ruined wool robe. We eventually found salvation, though salvation was a highly generous term for the 2 decorative, hand-embroidered face towels Darius managed to scrounge from a secondary shelf. 10 minutes later, the terrifying king of the realm and his supposed mate were pressed flat against the freezing stone wall of a drafty, dimly lit corridor. I was shivering violently in my damp camisole, but Darius was a walking furnace. He wore his tiny towel wrapped precariously around his waist. It barely covered a fraction of his massive, battle-scarred thighs. If the council finds out I am sneaking through the servant passages in a linen square the size of a handkerchief, I will abdicate, Darius hissed, peering cautiously around a marble pillar. Keep moving, I whispered, practically stepping on his bare heels. My toes are turning blue, and your towel is entirely reliant on a single precarious tuck. We darted across the open breezeway, our bare feet slapping softly against the cold marble. We were 10 yards from our private chambers when the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall swung open. A man holding a brass lantern stepped into the corridor. It was Lord Sterling's head spy. "Hide!" I squeaked, lunging behind a velvet curtain. "There is nowhere to hide," Darius rasped, grabbing my wrist as the lantern light swung toward us. If the spy saw our faces, the scandal would destroy the king's remaining political leverage. Logic completely abandoned the alpha. With a frantic, guttural sound, Darius slammed his back against the stone alcove, hauled me flush against his bare chest, and violently smashed his mouth down onto mine. It was not a gentle, romantic collision. It was an act of desperate political espionage. He angled his head to completely obscure my face from the corridor, his massive hand tangling in my wet hair to hold me still. I froze. My brain short-circuited. The spy's footsteps paused right next to our alcove. He cleared his throat loudly, clearly trying to shame the heavily breathing, tangled couple in the shadows. But Darius didn't pull away. Instead, the fake, desperate cover-up suddenly shifted. The king groaned, a deep, entirely involuntary vibration that echoed against my ribs. His other hand slid down to grip my hip, pressing me closer to the scorching heat of his skin. He tilted his head, parting my lips, completely forgetting the spy, the corridor, and the tiny towel. The kiss devoured me. It was cedar, sulfur, and overwhelming primal panic. The spy muttered an apology and scurried away, his boots echoing down the hall. But Darius kept kissing me, breathless and completely unhinged, until my knees literally buckled and he had to catch me against the wall. The king completely vanished. For 3 agonizing days following the bathhouse incident, Darius barricaded himself in the royal archives. He refused all audiences, claiming a sudden, desperate need to review a century of agrarian tax law. I did not sit in my chambers and weep over his rejection. I got incredibly, violently angry. I stormed into the dusty, cavernous archives, ignoring the horrified gasp of the head librarian. The air was thick with the scent of old vellum and cowardice. I found the most powerful predator in the realm hiding behind a towering stack of ledgers, looking thoroughly exhausted. "Was it the angle?" I demanded, slamming my hands down on his desk. Darius jumped, an actual undignified flinch. He knocked an inkwell over, scrambling to catch it. "Winifred, you cannot simply breach the royal sanctum." "I have a right to know," I interrupted, limping around the desk to corner him. "I am a rural noblewoman. We don't get much practice. Did I bite your lip? Was my breathing too loud? If my kissing technique is so catastrophic it drove you into a self-imposed agrarian exile, you owe me a critique." "Your kissing is not the issue," Darius barked, his dark eyes wide with actual panic as he stood up, aggressively backing away from me. "Then why are you treating me like I have the plague?" I pressed forward. "Because I cannot think," he bellowed, his boots hitting the base of a massive ancient bookshelf. He was breathing heavily, his hands gripping the edges of a priceless mahogany table. "The scent of you, the memory of... I am the king, Winifred. I am supposed to be an impenetrable fortress of logic, and currently, My brain is exclusively composed of fog and panic. "You're an idiot," I yelled, throwing my hands up. "I am a terrifying warlord," he argued desperately, taking another step backward to put space between my scent and his rapidly crumbling restraint. He misjudged the distance. His broad shoulders violently collided with a freestanding iron-wrought frame holding a massive, 1,000-pound velvet tapestry depicting the first Lichen King. The frame groaned loudly. Darius looked up. "Oh no!" The entire structure toppled forward. Darius lunged, grabbing me by the waist, and dragged us both to the floor just as the colossal, heavy velvet crashed down, burying us in absolute, suffocating darkness. It was pitch black, incredibly dusty, and smelled entirely of mothballs. "Are you crushed?" Darius's voice rumbled in the dark. He was hovering over me, bearing the brunt of the heavy velvet on his back like a heavily breathing, very stressed turtle. "Only my pride," I wheezed, squirming to find a comfortable position on the hard wooden floor. "Could you please lift this? It weighs more than a carriage." "It is caught on the iron frame," he rasped, shifting his weight. The velvet pulled tighter around us. "If I push up, the rod will snap and impale us. We must wait for the royal guards to notice the king is trapped under his own ancestors." The frantic comedy of the situation slowly bled out, leaving a heavy, terrifying intimacy in the confined space. We were inches apart. I could feel his breath ghosting over my collarbone. "I didn't flee because of you, Winifred," Darius whispered suddenly, the rigid cadence of his royal voice completely shattering. "I fled because I lost control. The council demands an alpha who is made of stone. If they see how easily you unravel me, how desperate I am for you, they will use you to destroy my reign." I blinked into the darkness, my heart slamming against my ribs. "They think I'm a joke, Darius. Look at me. I limp. I fall into mud. I am a broken toy pretending to be a queen. I thought you realized you couldn't be seen with a defective mate." A heavy, warm hand found my face in the dark. His calloused thumb brushed softly over my cheekbone. "You are the only real thing in a court entirely constructed of lies," Darius breathed, his voice thick with an emotion so raw it made my throat ache. "Your limp does not make you broken, Winnie. It makes you human, and I am utterly suffocated by perfection." The admission hung in the dusty air, profound and world-tilting. I blindly reached out, my fingers tangling in his dark, disheveled hair, and pulled his forehead down to rest against mine. For the first time since the absurd wager began, there was no panic, no banter, just a quiet, foundational trust. "We can lift it together," I whispered. "On 3. I'll push the iron, you push the velvet. 1, 2, 3. With a synchronized heave, Darius threw his massive shoulders upward while I shoved the iron rod sideways. The tapestry violently flipped backward, flooding us with the blinding light of the library windows. We sat up on the floor, breathless, covered in dust, my hands still tangled deeply in his hair, and his arm wrapped fiercely around my waist. Ahem! We both froze. Standing in the doorway of the archives, looking utterly scandalized, was the entire 12-member royal council, clutching their ledgers in sheer horror. The 12 elderly men of the royal council stood entirely motionless, their ledger books clutched to their chests like shields. I was still sitting on the floor, covered in centuries of dust, my fingers thoroughly tangled in the king's hair. Darius did not scramble to his feet. He did not yell. He very calmly reached up, plucked a massive dust bunny from my shoulder, and turned his head to face his government. "The structural integrity of the royal lineage is flawed," Darius deadpanned, his voice a dry, echoing rumble. We were inspecting the velvet. Lord Malcor, the head councilman whose face resembled a shriveled plum, stepped forward. This is an abomination of decorum. If she is to be your mate, she must prove her Luna Grace. We demand the menagerie tea test." Which is how, 3 hours later, I found myself holding a ridiculously fragile porcelain teacup, surrounded by 30 venomous aristocrats in the center of the royal menagerie. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint, unmistakable musk of caged predators. Darius stood 10 paces away, strictly forbidden from assisting me. His jaw was clenched so tightly I feared his teeth might shatter. "A true Luna," Lord Malcor announced loudly, sipping his tea, "projects an aura of absolute serenity. The beasts of the earth naturally bow to her tranquil spirit." I took a step backward, terrified of a nearby enclosure holding a pacing, golden-furred lynx. My bad leg throbbed. To catch my balance, I reached out and grabbed the nearest solid object, a heavy brass lever attached to the avian pavilion. "Oops," I whispered. The lever slammed downward. The iron gates swung open with a shrieking creak. A terrifying, unified squawk echoed from the darkness. It wasn't a serene flock of doves. I had just released 75 highly aggressive territorial royal peacocks. A tidal wave of iridescent blue feathers and razor-sharp talons flooded the tea party. The aristocratic women began screaming, abandoning their porcelain and fleeing into the hedges. The peacocks, enraged by the sudden sunlight, began violently pecking at the silver trays of cucumber sandwiches. Darius didn't move to help the nobles. He simply covered his mouth, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, catastrophic laughter. "Contain this madness!" Lord Malcor shrieked, batting a peacock away with his cane. Then I heard it, a low, demonic hiss. From the pavilion pond, the king's prized alpha swan, a massive, violently angry bird the size of a warhound, locked its black, soulless eyes entirely on Lord Malcor. It flared its colossal white wings and launched itself directly at the head councilman's face. "Look out!" I bellowed. Abandoning all Luna grace, I dropped my teacup, lunged forward off my good leg, and violently tackled the head councilman into the rhododendron bushes just as the swan's beak snapped the air where his throat had been. I scrambled off the groaning Lord Malcor, spitting out a mouthful of leaves. The demonic swan hissed, preparing for a second strike, but I grabbed a silver serving tray and held it up like a gladiator's shield. The bird bashed its beak against the metal with a deafening clang, stunning itself, before waddling away in a furious huff. Darius stopped laughing. His dark eyes widened, staring at me with an expression of sheer primal awe that made my lungs stop working entirely. The menagerie disaster somehow did not result in my execution. Instead, the court interpreted my unhinged swan tackle as a ferocious display of protective instinct. By the time the evening banquet rolled around, I was seated at the high table, exhausted, smelling faintly of rhododendrons, and wearing an utterly ridiculous silver gown. Darius sat beside me, radiating an intense protective heat. His thigh was pressed firmly against mine beneath the heavy damask tablecloth, grounding me amidst the suffocating chatter. Then, Ambassador Julian arrived. He was a foreign diplomat from the Southern Isles, possessing a ridiculously handsome face, a smile entirely composed of arrogance, and a cologne so aggressively spiced it made my eyes water. He bypassed the king entirely and leaned directly over my plate. "Lady Winifred," Julian purred, his voice dripping with practiced seduction. "I had heard tales of your unique charm. Tell me, how does a delicate flower survive in such a rigid, frozen court?" "Mostly by avoiding the poultry," I answered honestly, eyeing the roasted pheasant on the table with deep suspicion. "Delightful," Julian murmured, stepping even closer. His hand brushed the back of my chair. "Perhaps later I could show you the Southern method of tenderization. Our customs are far more accommodating to a woman's natural appetites." I blinked, completely missing the innuendo. "Oh, do you use a mallet? Our cooks pound the venison for hours, but it still tastes like shoe leather." A terrifying sound echoed from my left. It sounded like a glacier cracking in half. I turned my head. Darius's eyes had gone entirely, violently pitch black. His jaw was locked, the muscles in his neck straining against his velvet collar. The thick, solid silver goblet in his hand was caving inward, the metal groaning agonizingly as his fingers physically crushed it into a mangled sphere. Red wine dripped from his fist like blood. "Ambassador?" Darius growled, a sound so deep and feral it vibrated the silverware. "You are intruding on my airspace." Julian swallowed hard, taking a rapid step back. "Apologies, Your Majesty, just discussing culinary techniques." Before I could ask if we were still getting dessert, Darius stood up. He didn't yell. He simply grabbed the ambassador by the scruff of his incredibly expensive jacket and hauled him out of the banquet hall like a misbehaving puppy. Utterly confused, I slipped out of my chair and limped down the corridor to follow them. I paused outside the heavy mahogany door of the coat closet. Darius had the ambassador pinned against the wall. I expected a physical beatdown. Instead, the terrifying Alpha King was engaging in frantic, desperate bribery. "3 of my finest trade galleons," Darius hissed, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated panic. "Fully staffed, filled with Eastern silk. If you pack your bags and leave this continent before the midnight bell tolls." "3 ships?" Julian choked out. "Just to stop me from speaking to her? If you look at her again, I will burn your islands to the bedrock," Darius promised, completely unhinged. "Take the ships. Leave. Now." My stomach plummeted straight through the floorboards. I clamped a hand over my mouth, the devastating realization hitting me like a physical blow. He wasn't jealous. He was paying the man to go away so the council wouldn't see the ambassador as a better suitor. He was trying to get rid of the wager. The royal kitchens at midnight were a sweltering, cavernous sanctuary of stone ovens and hanging copper pots. The air was thick with the comforting, yeasty scent of rising dough and burnt sugar. It was the perfect place to have a complete emotional breakdown. I stood at the massive butcher block, aggressively kneading a giant lump of pastry dough. I was covered in flour from my elbows to my hairline. Tears tracked hot, silent paths down my cheeks, clumping the flour into a paste on my jaw. 3 trade ships. That was my exact value to the king. I was a political liability he was desperately trying to maneuver off his board. I punched the dough, my bad leg aching furiously as I leaned my weight into the wooden table. I had already packed my single, pathetic satchel. As soon as the dawn carriages arrived with the morning milk, I was going back to my mud puddles. The heavy iron kitchen doors suddenly blasted open with enough force to crack the stone wall. I jumped, dropping my rolling pin. Darius stood in the doorway. He was missing his formal velvet coat. His silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His hair was completely wild, and his chest was heaving as if he had just sprinted across the entire castle grounds. Which, considering he was supposed to be hosting a midnight trade summit with the Southern Isles, he probably had. 20 terrified bakers froze mid-whisk. Darius's wild, frantic eyes swept the room, instantly locking onto me. He marched forward, his heavy boots echoing like drum beats. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice entirely breathless. "I am making a tart," I snapped, grabbing the rolling pin like a weapon. "And then I am leaving. You don't have to bribe foreign dignitaries with your navy, Darius. I overheard you in the closet. If you want me gone to appease the council, just say so." Darius stopped dead, completely ignoring the flour dusting his immaculate trousers. You think I bought his departure to get rid of you? You traded 3 ships to stop him from talking to me," I yelled, swiping a tear away, leaving a thick streak of white across my nose. "I traded 3 ships because if he had remained in my line of sight for one more second, I would have ripped his throat out in front of the entire diplomatic corps," Darius bellowed. The bakers collectively gasped, clutching their wooden spoons in sheer horror. "I lost my mind, Winifred," the king continued, closing the distance between us, completely ignoring the butcher block separating us. "The scent of his cologne on your airspace made my blood boil. I didn't care about the summit. I don't care about the council. I don't care about the crown." You were jealous?" I whispered, dropping the rolling pin. "I am utterly feral," Darius rasped, stepping around the table. Right there, in the middle of the flour-covered floor, surrounded by terrified pastry chefs, the most feared Alpha King in the realm dropped heavily to his knees. He grabbed my flour-covered hands and pressed them flat against the scorching heat of his bare chest. "I am not playing a game, Winnie," he breathed, staring up at me with silver, desperately vulnerable eyes. "Mark me. Right now." The 20 bakers remained utterly paralyzed, gripping their whisks as if they were shields. I stared down at the terrifying Alpha King, whose impossibly broad shoulders were currently dusted in a thick layer of all-purpose baking flour. The sheer, overwhelming heat of his hands pressed against mine short-circuited every logical thought in my brain. "Darius," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You are making a massive, catastrophic spectacle." "I am securing my future," he rumbled, his thumbs brushing over my knuckles, and I refused to do it politely. I grabbed his hands, hauling him up from the stone floor. "We are leaving the kitchen before the pastry chef faints into the custard." I dragged the king of the realm by his wrist, practically sprinting, limping rapidly through the labyrinth of stone corridors until we violently shoved through the heavy oak doors of his private chambers. He kicked the doors shut behind us, the lock sliding into place with a definitive, echoing clank. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. The air grew incredibly heavy, thick with the intoxicating, unfiltered scent of cedar and rain. Darius didn't hesitate. He marched straight to his mahogany desk, snatched up the massive parchment roll of our fake courtship contract, and tossed it directly into the roaring fireplace. "Rule item number 7 is officially void," Darius breathed, turning to face me. The firelight cast flickering, golden shadows across the sharp angles of his face. "There is no more pretending, Winifred. No more mandatory stares. I want the reality, or I want nothing." He crossed the room, stopping inches from me. The power dynamic in the room tilted so drastically it made my head spin. He was a foot taller, 100 pounds heavier, and possessed enough primal strength to crush a silver goblet barehanded. Yet he looked at me with an expression of total, desperate submission. He reached up, his large hands trembling slightly, and unbuttoned the collar of his silk shirt, exposing the thick column of his throat. "Claim me," he rasped, his eyes completely dilated, entirely black. "Anchor me, Winnie, because if you walk out that door, I will tear this castle apart." My breath hitched. I reached up, my flour-dusted fingers resting against his scorching skin. I didn't second-guess my biology. I didn't apologize for my clumsiness. I simply pulled his head down, parted my lips, and sank my teeth firmly into the junction of his collarbone. A heavy, concussive shudder ripped through his massive frame. The biological click was instantaneous. His scent rushed over my tongue, spicy, rich, and overwhelmingly protective. With a ragged groan, Darius's arms banded around my waist, lifting my feet completely off the floor as he buried his face in my neck, holding me as if I were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. We woke hours later, hopelessly tangled in the silk sheets, enveloped in the dizzying warmth of our completely merged scents. Then, the violent, rhythmic clanging of the royal emergency bells shattered the morning air. "They know," Darius growled, ripping his velvet coat off the bedpost. The bells were only rung for a total collapse of the government or a fire in the treasury. We practically scrambled down the marble staircase, rushing into the high tribunal hall. The 12 members of the royal council were already gathered, their faces arranged in identical expressions of apocalyptic horror. Lord Malcor stood at the head of the table, shaking a rolled parchment in his fist. "Treason!" Malcor shrieked, pointing a trembling finger directly at Darius. Or rather, at the collar of Darius's hastily buttoned shirt. In our frantic dash to the hall, the top button had slipped. The fresh, deeply bruised crescent mark on the king's collarbone was practically glowing in the morning light. The hall erupted into absolute chaos. "He has been marked!" a duke bellowed from the gallery. "The king has submitted to a broken rural." "Silence!" Darius roared, his voice hitting the stone walls with the force of a physical blow. The room instantly quieted, terrified by the sheer volume of his alpha command. Darius stepped in front of me, shielding me with his massive frame. "She is your queen. You will address her with the respect the crown demands." She is a liability, Malchor spat, slamming his cane against the table. Look at her, Your Majesty. She cannot walk the ceremonial path. She has no pedigree, no political backing, and she tackles poultry. The law of the realm explicitly requires a Luna of physical perfection to maintain the strength of the bloodline. I am rewriting the law, Darius stated coldly, crossing his arms. You cannot, Malchor sneered, his eyes glittering with malicious triumph. The council has drafted a unified edict. If you do not exile this woman by sunset, we will dissolve the treasury. We will recall the border patrols. We will strip you of your crown and plunge this entire continent into a succession crisis that will starve millions. My stomach dropped straight into my boots. They weren't threatening my life. They were threatening the entire kingdom. They were going to let millions of innocent people suffer just to preserve their snobby medieval aesthetics. Darius's back went entirely rigid. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking as he prepared to declare a political war he couldn't possibly win, without destroying his own people. He was going to sacrifice his kingdom for me. I accept the consequences, Darius began, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating pitch. Let the treasury? No. I stepped out from behind him. My bad leg throbbed, but I forced myself to stand entirely straight. The entire council stared at me. Winnie, stop, Darius whispered, reaching for my arm. I pulled away, the physical distance tearing at my freshly bonded instincts. I looked the terrifying Alpha King directly in the eye, burying my own heartbreak under a mask of icy rural stubbornness. I don't want the crown, Darius, I lied, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned hall. And I certainly don't want a mate who comes with a bankrupt kingdom. The wager is over. I am going home. The courtyard was freezing, the wind whipping off the eastern mountains and biting through my thin traveling cloak. I stood beside the dilapidated wooden carriage that had brought me to the capital a month ago. My meager satchel was tossed onto the floorboards. Every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. The biological tether connecting my soul to Darius's was screaming in absolute agony, a constant physical ache pulling me toward the tallest tower of the castle. He is spiraling, my instincts whispered, reading the frantic, devastated energy radiating from the king's study across the courtyard. Inside that study, Darius was not roaring. He was not smashing furniture. According to the terrified whispers of the servants who had fled his wing, the king had locked the heavy oak doors, seated himself at his mahogany desk, and gone completely, dangerously silent. I gripped the wooden handle of the carriage door, forcing myself to climb the steps. It's for the best, I muttered to the driver, who was staring at me with profound pity. The realm needs a terrifying alpha, not a clumsy liability. Suddenly, the heavy blast of a brass herald's horn echoed across the cobblestones, vibrating the carriage wheels. A breathless royal messenger sprinted out of the main keep, clutching a massive scroll sealed with the black wax of the king's personal signet. He scrambled up the stone mounting block in the center of the courtyard, his chest heaving as he unrolled the heavy parchment. "Hear ye!" the messenger bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. "By the direct, indisputable hand of King Darius, the crown is hereby relinquished." I froze, one foot on the carriage step. "The king has signed an immediate edict of abdication," the herald continued, reading the frantic scrawl. "He surrenders all titles, lands, and authority to the royal council, effective immediately." My brain completely stalled. He hadn't fought them. He hadn't compromised. He had literally thrown away the most powerful seat in the world in the span of 20 minutes. Before I could even process the catastrophic scale of what he had just done, a deafening metallic screech echoed from the front of the castle. I whipped my head around. The colossal iron-wrought portcullis of the main gate was slamming downward. The massive steel spikes bit into the cobblestones with a resounding, ground-shaking crash. All around the perimeter, heavily armored royal guards were dropping heavy wooden barricades across the exits. "Driver!" I panicked, pointing at the closing gates. "Go, now!" "I cannot, my lady!" the driver shrieked, pulling back on the reins as a dozen guards armed with heavy halberds surrounded our carriage. The captain of the guard stepped forward, his expression entirely apologetic, but completely unyielding. "Forgive me, Lady Winifred," the captain said, gripping the reins of my horses. But the former king left one final, absolute command before surrendering his authority. "What command?" I demanded, leaning out the carriage window. The captain looked up at me, wincing slightly. "Nobody leaves the capital, especially not you." "I am not entirely sure you understand the concept of a carriage departure," I informed the captain of the guard, clutching the window frame as four heavily armored men practically lifted the entire wooden cab off its axles to turn it around. "The horses are supposed to go forward out of the gate, not backward into the courtyard." "My deepest apologies, Lady Winifred," the captain replied, looking profoundly stressed as he marched alongside the window. But the former king was extremely specific. The exact phrasing of his final royal decree was, and I quote, "If her carriage breaches the outer wall, I will personally feed the gatehouse to the peacocks." "He cannot do that," I argued, my voice pitching up in sheer panic. "He just abdicated. He is unemployed. He holds no legal authority to weaponize the poultry." "He is still 7 feet tall and in a catastrophically foul mood, my lady," the captain pointed out with ironclad logic. "I am not arguing with him. We are going to the ballroom." The sheer absurdity of the situation completely short-circuited my anger. I was not being dragged to a dungeon. I was not being escorted to a tribunal. I was being forcibly marched into the grand ballroom at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, wearing a travel-stained wool cloak over a highly wrinkled day dress. When the guards hauled open the massive, gilded mahogany doors, the wall of sound and heat that hit me was staggering. The king had not merely taken me hostage, he had taken the entire upper echelon of the government hostage. 300 aristocrats were crammed into the cavernous space. The midday sun streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating a sea of profoundly confused nobles who had clearly been dragged from their afternoon teas, fitting rooms and ledgers. Women in half-laced corsets were whispering frantically to men in riding breeches. The air smelled of melting beeswax, nervous perspiration, and absolute, unadulterated political panic. "What is happening?" a duchess near the entrance hissed, grabbing my elbow as the guards ushered me inside. "Are we under siege? Is it the Iron Horde?" "Worse," I muttered, shaking her off. "It is a man who refuses to process his emotions like a normal human being." Behind me, the heavy doors slammed shut. The undeniable, echoing thud of a massive wooden barricade dropping into the iron brackets sent a collective shriek through the crowd. We were locked in. A social hostage situation orchestrated by a feral, uncrowned alpha. The crowd parted nervously as I limped forward, my bad leg aching furiously from the stress of the morning. I made my way toward the center of the room, where the 12 members of the Royal Council were huddled around a refreshment table, looking like a flock of terrified pigeons. Lord Malcor was hyperventilating into a linen napkin. "This is madness. We accepted his abdication. He is a civilian. A civilian cannot legally detain the High Council." "Have you tried explaining that to the barricade?" I asked dryly, stopping a few feet away from the trembling politicians. Before Malcor could formulate a suitably venomous response, the heavy brass hinges of the private royal balcony high above us shrieked open. The entire ballroom went dead silent. You could have heard a single silk ribbon hit the marble floor. Darius stepped out onto the landing of the grand staircase. He looked absolutely nothing like a king. He wore no armor, no velvet, no gold thread. He was dressed in a simple, deeply unbuttoned linen shirt and dark trousers. His hair was a wild, completely disheveled mess, as if he had spent the last hour aggressively running his hands through it. He carried no weapons. He didn't need them. The sheer, overwhelming biological gravity of his presence pressed down on the room, suffocating the air right out of my lungs. He held the solid gold, jewel-encrusted crown of the realm casually in his left hand, gripping it by the arches as if it were a particularly heavy paperweight. His dark eyes swept the massive crowd, burning with a frantic, unyielding intensity, until they locked entirely onto me. The rest of the room simply ceased to exist for him. Without a single word, Darius began his descent. He walked slowly down the curving marble steps, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound. The nobles scrambled out of his path like water parting around a boulder. The tension was thick enough to chew. He reached the bottom of the stairs and marched directly toward the council's refreshment table. Lord Malcor squeaked, pressing himself backward against a towering display of cream puffs. Darius did not look at Malcor. He did not yell. He simply raised his left hand and casually tossed the priceless ancient crown onto the table. It landed in the center of a silver platter, completely flattening a strawberry tart with a sickening metallic crunch. The gasps from the aristocracy were deafening. Darius ignored them all. He turned his broad back on the terrified council, stepping over the crushed pastries, and walked straight toward me, his chest heaving, leaving the highest seat of power in the world dripping in fruit preserves. I stood completely frozen as Darius stopped inches in front of me. The overwhelming scent of him, rich cedar, sharp rain, and the unmistakable heavy spice of pure devotion flooded my senses. The absolute madness of what he had just done crashed over me. He had thrown away a kingdom that spanned a continent. He had abandoned a lineage that had stood for 1,000 years. All because of a single, highly stubborn rural noblewoman who could barely walk in a straight line. "You are a catastrophic idiot," I breathed, my voice trembling violently as I stared up into his wild, dark eyes. "You cannot just toss the crown into the jam, Darius. Millions of people rely on you." "They rely on a king," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shockwave straight down my spine. "And I cannot be a king if my soul is currently packed in a wooden carriage bound for the mud puddles of the outer provinces." "They will exile you," I warned, a hot tear spilling over my lower lash line. "You will have nothing." "I have you," he replied, raising a large, calloused hand to gently wipe the tear from my cheek with his thumb. "And frankly, Winifred, I find running an empire significantly less exhausting than trying to convince you to stay." I let out a wet, hysterical laugh, leaning my face into his palm. "We are trapped in a ballroom with 300 angry politicians." "Then we should make use of the space," he said smoothly. Darius finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping the terrified string quartet cowering in the corner near the potted ferns. The musicians were clutching their cellos as if the instruments might protect them from his wrath. "Play," Darius commanded, his voice projecting across the silent hall without a shred of effort. The lead violinist frantically raised his bow. "What shall we play, sir?" "A waltz," Darius answered, turning back to me. He stepped impossibly close, his intense body heat seeping entirely through my heavy wool cloak. He offered his hand. "A slow one." I stared at his outstretched palm. "Darius, I am wearing travel boots. I am in a heavy cloak. And, in case the entire council failed to remind you, I physically cannot waltz. I will ruin your shoes, and I will embarrass us both." "You could never embarrass me, Winnie," he said fiercely, grabbing my hand and pulling me flush against his chest. He didn't wait for my permission. He wrapped his massive right arm securely around my waist, anchoring my uneven center of gravity entirely against his solid frame. The string quartet, trembling with sheer terror, struck up a slow, beautiful melody that echoed into the vaulted ceilings. Darius took the first step. I braced for the inevitable fumble. I expected him to drag me through the graceful, sweeping motions of a traditional court dance, forcing me to awkwardly skip and stumble to keep up with his incredibly long, athletic stride. Instead, Darius stepped onto his left foot and deliberately dipped his right shoulder. My breath hitched. He took another step, dragging his right foot slightly, perfectly mimicking the uneven, halting rhythm of my bad leg. He wasn't mocking me. He was completely, flawlessly adapting his entire biological momentum to match my exact limitation. "Darius," I whispered, utterly stunned as he spun us gently around the marble floor. "If the law demands the Luna walk the ceremonial path in perfect grace," he murmured, his lips brushing my temple as we swayed to our own entirely broken rhythm, "then I will simply ensure the king walks the exact same way. They can judge us both. We danced. It wasn't sweeping. It wasn't graceful. It was a lopsided, halting, incredibly beautiful disaster. He held me so securely that my bad leg didn't ache at all. We moved through the center of the grand ballroom, an uncrowned king and his flawed mate, completely ignoring the traditions of the realm. The silence of the crowd slowly began to crack. It started with a young duchess near the back. Moved by the sheer, undeniable romance of the massive, terrifying man willingly breaking his stride for the woman he loved, she tapped her silk heel against the marble. Tap. Pause. Tap. A young lord beside her joined in. Thud. Pause. Thud. Within moments, the younger nobles and the common staff hiding in the corridors began to stomp their feet. They weren't clapping to the music. They were stomping to the rhythm of our lopsided dance. The sound swelled. A massive, thunderous beat of absolute, overwhelming support that drowned out the string quartet entirely, shaking the floorboards beneath our feet. The music finally swelled to a close, but the thunderous, rhythmic stomping of 300 nobles did not stop. It echoed through the ballroom, a deafening drumbeat of social rebellion. Darius held me firmly against his chest, completely unapologetic, as the crowd began to cheer. Not polite, aristocratic golf claps, but genuine, raucous cheering. Lord Malcor looked as though he was going to spontaneously combust. The head councilman stood beside the crushed strawberry tart, his complexion a terrifying shade of violently mottled purple. He stared at the cheering aristocracy, then down at the jam-covered crown, and finally, at the imposing, entirely unbothered man holding me. The council had wagered everything on the assumption that the public would demand perfection. They had severely miscalculated the public's desperate thirst for a good romantic scandal. "Stop this!" Malcor shrieked, waving his cane wildly at the stomping nobles. "This is a violation of protocol. He is a civilian. You are cheering for a civilian." The crowd completely ignored him. A duke actually threw his feathered hat into the air. Malcor realized with terrifying clarity that he had lost the narrative. If Darius walked out of those doors, the council wouldn't just lose their best military tactician. They would face a full-scale social uprising. The common nobles adored this messy, hilarious, fiercely devoted couple, far more than they cared about the ancient laws of physical perfection. Malcor scrambled forward, practically shoving a terrified bishop out of his way, and dropped to his knees right at the edge of the dance floor. "Your Majesty!" Malcor begged, his voice cracking loudly over the cheering. "Please, you cannot simply leave the throne in a pile of fruit preserves. The eastern borders, the trade routes, the paperwork." Darius didn't even blink. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, utterly ignoring the groveling politician. "Are you hungry, Winnie? I believe there are still a few cream puffs that survived the crown." "Wait!" Malcor yelled, crawling a few inches forward. We were hasty. We will overlook the poultry incident. We will withdraw the Edict of Exile. Just take the crown back." Darius finally turned his head, looking down his nose at the councilman with an expression of profound boredom. "I am no longer the king, Malcor. If you wish to negotiate the terms of my employment, you will have to speak to my management." He looked down at me, a highly amused, completely feral smirk playing on his lips. I blinked. The power dynamic in the room suddenly shifted entirely onto my shoulders. I looked at the groveling councilman, then at the cheering crowd, and finally felt the heavy, unshakable support of Darius's arm around my waist. My bad leg didn't matter. My lack of pedigree didn't matter. I had the biggest, scariest man in the realm backing my play. I cleared my throat, stepping slightly out of Darius's embrace, though he kept his hand firmly on my hip. "Well, Lord Malcor," I began, my voice carrying clearly as the crowd quieted to listen. "If my mate is to return to his incredibly stressful desk job, there will be a few minor adjustments to the bureaucratic structure." "Anything!" Malcor wheezed, sweating profusely. "First," I said, ticking it off on my fingers, The menagerie tea test is officially abolished. It is a ridiculous hazard, and the swans are fundamentally evil. Done, Malcor agreed frantically. Second, I continued, pacing slightly, leaning into my limp with total confidence. The clause requiring the Luna to possess physical perfection is permanently stricken from the legal codex. Beauty is entirely subjective, and frankly, I look spectacular in green silk. A loud cheer erupted from the back of the room. Darius's chest vibrated with a suppressed laugh against my shoulder. Agreed, stricken entirely, Malcor yelled. And finally, I said, pointing a finger directly at the head councilman's nose, my village is getting paved roads, not gravel, stone, funded entirely by the council's private wine budget. Malcor visibly died inside, clutching his chest, but he nodded weakly. The stones shall be laid by spring. I smiled, a bright, completely victorious grin, and turned to Darius. The terrifying alpha was looking at me with such absolute, overwhelming devotion I thought my heart might actually stop beating. I reached up, grabbed the lapels of his wrinkled linen shirt, and pulled him down to my level. Well, I whispered, the words brushing against his lips just before the crowd erupted into absolute pandemonium. I suppose you can keep your day job. The roar of the ballroom was deafening, but it all faded into a dull hum the second Darius's mouth crashed down on mine. It was not a polite political kiss, it was a complete biological claiming in front of 300 aristocrats. His massive hand cradled the back of my head, anchoring me against the overwhelming furnace of his chest while his other arm held my waist so securely my bad leg didn't bear an ounce of weight. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, Lord Malcor was actively weeping into a table napkin. Though whether from the sheer romance or the sudden loss of his private wine budget, I couldn't be entirely sure. 3 weeks later, the high cathedral of the capital smelled overwhelmingly of burning frankincense, crushed winter roses, and absolute unprecedented bureaucratic panic. The council had spent 21 agonizing days rewriting 5 centuries of ceremonial law. They had ripped out the perfectly leveled marble stairs leading to the high altar, replacing them with a gently sloping, carpeted ramp so I wouldn't have to navigate steps. I stood at the base of that ramp, the heavy, gold-threaded silk of my coronation gown weighing down my shoulders, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Darius stood beside me, radiating an intense, scorching heat that seeped straight through his ceremonial velvet and warmed my trembling hands. His dark eyes were entirely focused on me, his pupils blown wide, completely ignoring the thousands of nobles packed into the pews. He looked terrifyingly magnificent, an apex predator forced into a starched collar. "You are sweating, Your Majesty," I whispered, keeping my gaze fixed straight ahead as the high priest began the opening chants. "I am wearing 3 layers of boiled wool, Winifred," Darius rasped, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that only my enhanced proximity allowed me to hear. And my mate looks so devastatingly beautiful, I am currently utilizing every ounce of my alpha restraint not to throw you over my shoulder and carry you back to the royal chambers. A furious blush crawled up my neck. "We are in a place of reverence, Darius. Stop projecting your feral thoughts into my airspace. You are making my knees weak." "Good," he murmured, his thumb subtly stroking the inside of my wrist, sending a sharp electric jolt straight to my core. "If your knees give out, I will simply carry you through the rest of the ceremony. I believe we have established that the council will accept whatever I tell them is a primal tradition." I choked back a highly inappropriate laugh, disguising it as a cough. The high priest, a severely ancient man who looked as though he might crumble to dust if a strong wind blew, raised his trembling hands. The entire cathedral fell dead silent. "We gather to witness the binding of the crown and the anchor," the priest echoed, his voice wavering. "Step forward, King Darius, and present the token of eternity to your chosen Luna." We walked up the ramp together. He did not pull ahead. He slowed his impossibly long stride, perfectly matching my uneven, limping gait. There was no shame in the movement. It was a synchronized, unified march. We reached the altar. The priest held out a velvet cushion carrying the ceremonial ring, a massive, impossibly heavy band of solid gold, completely encrusted with raw diamonds. It looked less like jewelry and more like a very expensive brass knuckle. Darius reached out, his massive fingers delicately pinching the terrifying piece of jewelry. He turned to me, his dark eyes softening into a pool of absolute, overwhelming devotion. The intimidating warlord vanished, leaving only the man who had slept in a pile of hay just to spite a rival. With this, I bind my wolf, my crown, and my soul to yours, Darius recited, his voice thick with an emotion so heavy it made the air in the cathedral vibrate. He held the ring out. I lifted my left hand, my fingers trembling wildly. "You are shaking, Winnie," he whispered, a small, achingly tender smile touching his lips. "It weighs more than my head," I whispered back, completely overwhelmed by the intensity of his gaze. "Just shove it on." He reached for my finger. I shifted my weight. My heavy silk sleeve caught the edge of the velvet cushion. The ancient, priceless ring slipped from his grip. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, echoing clink. Time slowed down. We both watched in absolute horror as the heavy gold band bounced once, rolled rapidly to the left, and dropped straight through the slots of the ornate iron heating grate embedded in the floor. Plink, plunk, splash. The silence that followed was catastrophic. It was a vacuum of sheer, unadulterated panic. 3,000 nobles collectively stopped breathing. The high priest looked down at the empty grate, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating trout. I wheezed, the blood completely draining from my face as I stared at the dark hole in the floor. I think I dropped the dynasty. Darius stared at the grate. He stared at the horrified priest. He looked down at my pale, terrified face. For a terrifying second, his chest hitched. I thought he was going to roar. Instead, King Darius threw his head back and let out a booming, earth-shattering, joyous laugh. The sound ripped through the suffocating silence of the cathedral, rich and deep and completely uncontrolled. He was laughing so hard his broad shoulders shook, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "Darius!" I hissed, frantically mortified, but the corners of my mouth were already betraying me. "The ring was incredibly gaudy anyway," he bellowed, his laughter completely infecting the room. He didn't ask for a replacement. He didn't demand the guards pry up the floorboards. Darius reached forward, wrapped his massive hands around my face, and pulled me in. He kissed me fiercely, right there over the heating grate, completely rewriting the rules of the realm one last time. It was messy, loud, and gloriously imperfect. As the cathedral finally erupted into deafening cheers, his biological scent wrapped around me, spicy, warm, and feeling entirely, perfectly like home. Our chaotic reign had officially begun.